SAT test. And this student did as well. But when you get rid of all of that and you say, okay, you introduced the SAT because you said that there were different levels of prior education at high schools. We want to reintroduce it on the back end because we feel that there's different levels of instruction quality at universities. So just as you suspected high schools were of uneven quality, we now suspect that colleges, i.e. Stanford, Harvard, Yale, are of uneven quality. And the BA would mean nothing, just like you said the GPA was mean nothing unless it was coupled with a SAT score. So to get a BA, everybody has to take the test that you outlined, whether you went to school or not. And another thing, you talked about accreditation. If we could just give every student graduating in the United States the choice, you can go through the School of Education, and that's really the catalyst for wokeness, because it trains all of our K through 12 public. Or you have the alternative of going and get a master's degree for 1 year in an academic subject, chemistry, biology, English. I think the vast majority of BAs would prefer to go get a master's degree in an academic subject, and I think let's
talk about that. Let's talk about that for a minute. So, and I've talked to Larry Arnn about this, who's the president of Hillsdale. So. From what I understand at the moment, about 50% of American state budgets are dedicated to education, broadly speaking. So that's an awful lot of money. Now, interestingly enough, and let's say pathologically enough, the faculties of education have a hammerlock on teacher accreditation. And that strikes me as absolutely preposterous. It's a form of monopoly and there's no excuse whatsoever for it. Now, I've watched faculties of education for 60 years, and they are not the faculties of education are not credible academic institutions by and large. They have been responsible for some of the worst frauds ever perpetrated on the buying public. So whole word reading is a good example of that. The whole bloody self-esteem movement, which was a complete catastrophe. The idea of different learning styles, the idea of multiple intelligences, etc. We can lay that all at the foot of the faculties of education. And generally, they attract pretty damn bad students. And there's no evidence whatsoever that their so-called education training produces better teachers. They have been 100% not only derelict in their duties for like 60 years, but they've actually been what they've done has been antithetical to the general research tradition. Very, very low quality research, most of it irreproducible, most of it based on idiot ideology, and definitely not in the public interest. So here's an idea. How about every governor in the United States just scraps the requirement to have a teaching certificate to be able to teach? You wouldn't even need a master's degree. You could say, we will open up the teaching profession to anybody who graduated in the top 20% of their class. And then, poof, you don't have faculties of education anymore, and you don't have these institutions. Like, if you think about the idea of the long march through the institutions, the place where that's being focused most intently and with most efficiency with regards to the propagation of woke ideology is definitely through the faculties of education. And the only reason they have a single cent of dollar value is because they have a monopolistic hammerlock on teacher certification. And that should be scrapped. There's a teacher shortage in the US anyways. And there's no bloody evidence at all that the faculties of education have produced teachers who know how to teach.
We have this Orwellian system in the United States in which you can be 18 years old in May in a high school graduating, and your teacher has to have a credential. And then over the summer, you will enroll for the fall in a community college, supposedly at a higher level of instruction. And the community college teacher does not need a credential. They need a master's. In some cases, they can get exemptions. So there's no logic to it other than the self-interest of the teachers union. But I guess what I'm getting at is that whether it was the COVID lockdown or the George Floyd ignition of the acceleration of the woke movement, we're in really revolutionary times as far as higher education. And the economy, I don't think, is, given the smaller pool of applicants and people not choosing to go to, there's no economic rationale to support these universities in their present course. And I think there's going to be a radical change. I used to talk to people in Silicon Valley and they would say, Victor, we know that Stanford doesn't teach very well, but they do one priceless bit of research for us. When we hire a Stanford graduate, we know that they had to be very, very bright on test scores and GPA. And now, if you take that away, they have no reason to tap their graduates, since they're not going to learn very much, and their admissions are no longer meritocratic. And so I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's
and then the other thing that they sold was they sold one. They said to the employer, "We will train people and you will like them, but even if we don't, we were so stringent and careful in our admissions, you're going to get somebody that's naturally talented." But then they also, with a wink and a nod, said this to the parent: "And we're going to get the scions and the children of the elite, and we're going to have them all here." And so you mentioned the social interaction of a campus experience.
Yeah.
But they can't even offer that anymore, because if you are making your criteria based on gender and race and sexual orientation and not merit for whatever reason, then the chances are that people are not going to, at Harvard or Yale or Princeton, have a roommate whose father had a corporation that he wanted to work in, or a coder, all of those ties that they, with a wink and a nod, sell the parent, because they're not even a clearinghouse for the elite anymore, where they make these relationships that last throughout their entire life to their own benefit and advantage. They can't even sell that. So in a very, just disinterested fashion, I don't see what they have to offer anymore to anybody.
Well, let's pursue that a little bit farther, because there's other points of failure on the university front that we could concentrate on too. So as I progressed through the ranks at Harvard and then at the University of Toronto, I also watched the multiplication of adjunct faculty. And so just so everyone who's listening knows, most departments, abetted by their administrators, but also pursuing a very narrow and foolish self-interest, have farmed out a lot of their teaching to so-called adjuncts. And so at some places, that's 50% of the teaching population. So now, if you're a full professor at a heavy-duty research institution, you have to conduct research. So you need a lab, you have to have graduate students who are pursuing original research, and you have to teach, and you have to do a certain amount of administrative work. And you're evaluated on the basis of your research, your teaching, and your administrative work, basically in that order. Now, if you are a full professor, you're in the tenure stream, and you'll be guaranteed a certain degree of job security after putting in your apprenticeship. But if you're an adjunct professor, so that's a part-time professor, and that's 50% of the professors now, you don't have a research enterprise, you don't have any graduate students, you don't have a permanent office, you don't get paid anything, you get just paid an absolute pittance, nowhere near enough to live on. You do 50% of the teaching at the universities. Now, this is very convenient for the administrators, because the adjunct faculty have zero political power, like zero, or less than zero even, and they can be fired or dealt with in any manner whatsoever at a moment's notice with no problem. And as there are more and more adjuncts, there are fewer and fewer full-time faculty. And so not only are the universities failing to assess the students properly and then group them together in peer groups that would be of some economic utility across time, and elevating the tuition fees completely beyond comprehension at the same time, they're also radically decreasing the quality and the influence of the professoriate at precisely the same time, as well as not hiring enough of them, because administrators have multiplied like rabbits and faculty numbers have remained relatively constant. So they're whittling away the quality of the students on the one hand as fast as they possibly can, but they're doing exactly the same thing to the faculty on at least two fronts, the DEI front plus the adjunct faculty front. And I complained about this at the University of Toronto for years. I used to tell my colleagues, it's like, why don't we require that the administration set a cap to adjuncts, like 20% of the faculty, force them to hire more full-time faculty equivalents, because that's who should be hired to serve the students properly. And the response from my colleagues was always something like, well, it's pretty convenient for us to have these adjuncts pick up the excess teaching load, and we don't want to put too much pressure on the administration. I thought, that's fine, guys. That's a hell of a good long-term strategy. It's like, Good luck with that over 20 years. And so here we are now. The universities are making, I would say, 10 fatal errors on the business front, not just one. There's so many errors that it's almost it's a miracle of incompetence. And I do think it's going to produce a precipitous collapse.
I do too. And I think, just in conclusion, that this is all done by egalitarians. These are people who are very critical of